today in Rich in Relationship. We're going to talk about what to do when betrayal feels like the norm. When there's a breach of trust, there's confusion and sometimes a sense of devastation. I've worked with couples where one partner was devastated. Feelings are the fertile ground of the lessons we need to be strong. If we're feeling inadequate and we express it, the expression of that emotion is the opportunity to find the lesson that makes us more than adequate. Welcome to another episode of Rich in Relationship. I'm your host, Rich Heller, and today we're talking about betrayal as a failure of the system. A lot of times we take betrayal very personally, and sometimes, let's be honest, it is, but a large percentage of the time, it's actually a breakdown in the systems of your relationship. Or it might be a breakdown in the systems of your family. Or it might be a breakdown in the systems of your business if you happen to be working together. Right? Systems are what support consistency and fulfillment. Okay, a business owner, Simon, writes, when someone betrays their partner, whether it's an affair, hiding money, or breaking trust, it's usually treated like personal failure. But sometimes I wonder, do these things happen in a vacuum, or are there deeper dynamics that lead up to them? And that is a fantastic question, right? I mean, our reaction when we're betrayed is usually, you SOB, how could you do this to me? You must be some kind of evil person, right? That's when we're in that victim space of hurt, that's what it feels like. And when we take a step back and step back into our conscious mind, our cognitive, our thinking brain, we can see that there's usually a trail that leads to it. There might be an ecology or an environment that we've helped create, either by not pushing against it, or maybe even actively, that supported and encouraged that betrayal. We talked about it in the last episode when we touched briefly on infidelity. We pointed out that sometimes when infidelity happens, when one person breaks trust with their partner in some way, shape, or form, emotional, physical, financial, when that happens, usually the person who feels their trust has been broken ignored needs that were being expressed by the other person. They either dismissed them, discounted them, or had complete and utter denial about them. I'm going to say that again. What we talked about in the last episode is when there's a breach of trust or betrayal, and one person in some way violates a trust around physical intimacy, emotional intimacy, financial security, any area of trust that you would consider a breach of trust. The person who feels like they're the victim, and I'm not saying that they're not the victim, I'm saying typically when that person steps back and thinks about it, and talks about it, they can see that there were indications, that the other person was giving indications that a need of theirs was not being met in some way. And that person who was the victim either dismissed it, denied it completely to themselves, or in some way belittled it as not really a problem. And that happened more than once, usually. Usually it happens several times. Now, that's not saying that the person who experienced being a victim is causal. It's saying that they did not meet a responsibility that they agreed to in the relationship. And the responsibility is, our responsibility in a committed relationship is, usually, I have sworn to support you in your personal growth and make sure that you are fulfilled and happy and purposeful in your life. And you are sworn in my personal growth to make sure I'm fulfilled and happy and purposeful in my life. And the breach there to the other person is they gave an indication that a need wasn't being met, unconsciously or consciously, and the person who experiences the ultimate victimization did not see it or meet it, or acknowledge it even. When there's a breach of trust, there's confusion and sometimes a sense of devastation. I've worked with couples where one partner was devastated. In fact, I was amazed that they wanted to work on the marriage, but their value of marriage and family was so high that even though they were devastated, they were willing to get in the room and at least make things right in the moment. with the understanding that they might not stay together, but if they can at least heal this breach as parents, they can move forward together, apart, or together. And when you're working together and you're parents and this happens, the expense, the costs are so much higher. Imagine that you're working with someone, you're joint entrepreneurs, co-owners in a business together, and you're married, and you have children, and some major breach of trust occurs. You feel betrayed, and the cost of taking all that apart is huge. In fact, I've worked with some couples where, because they were in that exact position, they didn't address the breach of trust. They just continued on angry and upset and hurt, both of them. And it just got worse and worse. Our hope always when there's a breach of trust is that there will be first understanding, at least the hope that that other person might recognize why I'm feeling the way that I'm feeling, that they'll understand, at least intellectually, if not empathetically, emotionally connecting from their own sense of loss at some point in their life. Understanding not only the emotional situation, but the deeper conditions that allowed the betrayal to emerge, the breakdowns in the systems, whether they were conscious or unconscious, that led to that breakdown to happen. In a business, when you've got players, there's usually a procedures manual and a policy manual, and those manuals, and reading and signing on to an understanding and agreeing to adhere to those manuals, are saying we have systems in place to make sure that certain breakdowns don't happen. And when those breakdowns happen anyway, it's either because something was missing in the systems, or because the system was not reinforced, or because the person made an unconscious or conscious decision to break from the policies and procedures. Marriages are very similar in this, but the policies and procedures often aren't written out. And some of the work that we do with people who are working together and married is we help them to figure out their policies and procedures at home, and separate out their purpose at home separate from their purpose at work, for example. Couples who work together, betrayals fracture everything, not just the relationship, not just the parenting agreement, but also the business. And Brad and Gwen, remember Brad and Gwen? Brad and Gwen, generic names for clients that we've had. Brad and Gwen, names that we use to protect the innocent, situations that don't match exactly situations that we work with, but situations that are real. Brad and Gwen had been under intense pressure for years. The business was growing rapidly. Their schedules were packed. And most conversations revolved around operations and logistics, both at home and at work. But their emotional connection had quietly thinned, and there were needs not being expressed, or being expressed in subtle ways that were being ignored because the logistics took priority. Brad started texting frequently with a new client. Gwen noticed the shift immediately, but when Brad said, hey, this is work, she just wrote it off, even though she could tell there was something different about it. Conversations weren't explicitly romantic, but the emotional energy was noticeable, tangible. But Gwen accepted his explanation. Eventually, texting with this client was taking up a very large percentage of Brad's time, much more time than the value of the professional relationship would indicate. And Gwen said, I don't think you realize how far this has gone already. And Brad said, it's not what you think. We're just talking. Brad had not crossed a line physically, but something had fractured, and that was emotional exclusivity. And when they talked about it deeper, Brad finally started sharing that this client understood how he was feeling in a way that Gwen didn't seem to, that this client was sharing her experiences that were very similar to his, that he felt a simpatico with her, and that he didn't think there was anything wrong with it. But Gwen was shattered. Why? Because he had crossed an emotional boundary. He had been emotionally intimate with this client, who was more than a client at this point, obviously, his friend/client, in a way that he wasn't being with Gwen anymore. She felt violated, and she was hurt, and she was sure that they needed to tank the business and that they needed to get divorced. But to Brad's credit, he owned that he had made a mistake, that he had taken a misstep. He didn't see it when he first took it, but he owned that. The kinds of sharing he was doing with this woman, first, he owned that Gwen's perspective. He said, well, I don't agree with it, but I see what you're feeling. I see that, you and I haven't been talking the way we used to. And I see that I have shared some things with this person that I used to share with you. Then as he dug deeper personally into himself, he could remember times when he'd had this experience. He could remember as a child that his father and mother had had this exact same problem and the pain that his mom had experienced. And he remembered as a child wondering why his dad was so preoccupied and not present. And he started to look at his own family and see that that's what was going on there. And he turned to Gwen and he said, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I was acting out a script that I learned from my dad and I didn't even know I was doing it. And Brad and I did some work on that. And we helped him work through that. They identified that in the system of their marriage, they had stopped having vulnerable conversations where they both felt heard and nurtured. And they created, it doesn't sound very romantic what I'm going to say right now, but it's really important. They created a structure to support regular, intimate conversation. Intimate mean, I don't mean like, oh baby, let's do it intimate. I mean like, this is what's going on in my heart intimate. This is what I'm afraid of. I'm so, and Brad had been afraid of a lot. He had been very concerned that he was failing as a father. He'd been very concerned that he couldn't talk to Gwen about these things anymore. And this other person had made a space for him to share it. And Brad realized his mistake, and Gwen realized that she had seen the signs all along, but she had bought his excuses because she was really worried about what was going on in their business and that they wouldn't have the money they needed for their kids. When you work together and you're married together, it gets a lot more complicated. But this can happen even if you work separately, or even if only one of you is working and the other one is preoccupied, busy with multiple children and making sure that their well-being is cared for. This can happen under any circumstances. As a result of this systems failure, their marital system failure, their partnership had become almost entirely operational, leaving little room for emotional intimacy. Stress and responsibility had crowded out play and curiosity. And play and curiosity are vital. We've got some previous episodes in this series on play and curiosity. Go check them out. Difficult conversations about exhaustion and loneliness had been avoided for months. And these are really important. And to some extent, right, they'd been avoided because Brad was afraid if he talked about it, if he admitted that he was lonely and exhausted, that he might not keep going. He was stuck on when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And this conversations that he'd had with this client had just sort of evolved. She had seen the need and she had pulled it out of him. And when Gwen found out that that's how this had gone down, that it wasn't his intention, that it had evolved because this client had made the space and asked the questions that pulled this out of him, she realized she could have been doing the same. She took some ownership, some responsibility. There was a learning that happened there, right? And if you listen to the last episode, all emotion is there for us to learn. Now, none of this justified Brad's behavior, by the way. Like Gwen didn't say, oh, that's totally justified. What Gwen said was, oh, I see how I could do what she was doing. And Brad didn't say, well, if you had done that in the first place, I wouldn't be acting out this way. Brad said, I know what I did was a mistake. I didn't know how to articulate my needs, but now that I know, I will articulate them in the future. They altered the systems of their marriage, but they also altered their internal systems, their internal understanding. They learned from the situation lessons. They took the lessons and applied them. First through agreements and maintaining those agreements, but then after a while, it just became natural. After a while, they didn't even need to stick to a schedule anymore. They needed to have those kinds of conversations, and they reestablished emotional transparency because it became safe to say, I feel inadequate. It became safe to say, I feel disappointed. It became safe to say, I feel hurt. It became safe to say, I feel sad for Gwen and Brad. And men, I know that those sentences are not easy to say. Not just for me, for all men. I know they're not easy to say. And I know there's a fear that if you say those to your wife, she's going to think you're weak and not the provider and protector you need to be. And women, Some of you actually believe that nonsense, that if your husband shows weakness, weakness being I can be hurt, weakness being I can be sad, weakness being I can feel alone, weakness being I feel violated like a victim, I feel inadequate. Because you believe that if they say that to you, they are weak, you are destining the system of your marriage to fail. Men need to express these feelings because feelings are the fertile ground of the lessons we need to be strong. If we're feeling inadequate and we express it, the expression of that emotion is the opportunity to find the lesson that makes us more than adequate, more than enough. Victors, not victims. Conquerors, if you will. Real power comes in vulnerability. Intimacy, connection in marriage comes from vulnerability, and men need to be vulnerable as much as women. They also created boundaries around outside relationships. How would they each speak to particularly the opposite sex? Sometimes, Brad reported to me, he noticed that he says things to women that's not completely appropriate. He had a related conversation that went like this. He was in the park with his dog, and a pretty woman said to him, pet the dog, and said, you see, that's all the dog wants is to be pet. And Brad jokingly said, well, tell that to my wife, Gwen. She needs to hear that one. And the woman looked at him kind of strange, and Brad realized he'd crossed a line unconsciously there. That he was saying, hey, I'm not being pet enough, and I see you know how to pet. And so he had to handle that. And he handled that by he didn't go to his wife and say, honey, I unconsciously came onto a woman in the park. He handled it by saying, honey, I really need to be acknowledged and validated, and I really like touch. Not even sex. I really like touch. I'd like you to just cuddle me sometimes. And Brad admitted that unconscious remark he made in his own mind was more acceptable than going to Gwen and saying, hey, you know what? Sometimes I just need to be held, because he was afraid that Gwen was going to judge him. And so it came out in our work that he was able to say that to Gwen, and Gwen said, oh, honey, I can be there for you. So guys and gals, I know that sometimes you say things that are inappropriate to other people, inappropriate in terms of the understanding that you have with your partner. And like Brad, I'm encouraging you to take that lesson and apply it. And you don't have to reveal how you learn the lesson, or you can, depending on your partner. But what's really important is that you take the lesson and that you apply it. What's really important is that you create boundaries around outside relationships, that you reintroduce intentional connection rituals. Like, honey, sometimes I just need to cuddle. Brad took full responsibility for his breach. Gwen was able to take responsibility for her lapses and express the depth of the impact. And the healing process involved redesigning their relational system so that the conditions that allowed the breach to happen would not quietly, under the radar, return. When betrayal occurs, most people focus on the act itself. There's something wrong with the other person. But the act is often the final stage of a wider systemic breakdown in the relationship, whatever kind of relationship it is. Relationships have what you might call an integrity system, a set of structures that protect emotional connection and shared accountability. When that system weakens, several warning signs often appear. Emotional distance becomes normalized. Stress replaces curiosity. Important conversations are avoided. Outside relationships begin carrying emotional energy that once belonged inside the partnership. And this can happen in friendships too, by the way. You may have a friend who's drifted off, but the difference is that you didn't vow to be exclusive friends forever and ever and to not be friends with anyone else. But if you notice that you have a very good friend who's drifted off, it's important to say something, to speak up, and to notice your part in it. Betrayal doesn't start with a decision. It often starts as an unconscious expression of need. A lot like the story I gave you about Brad in the park. That was an unconscious expression of need. He didn't plot and plan. It just came out, and he regretted it immediately. Understanding that disconnection that's gone unaddressed for too long can come out that way doesn't excuse it. But understanding it does allow the lesson to be learned and the amends to be made in behavior. It helps couples to understand what must be rebuilt if healing is going to be possible. What we helped Brad and Gwen with was clear ownership of what they had been doing and had not been doing, clear ownership of the breach and its impact, that each of them was accountable for what they did and did not do. And once they had acknowledged that, they could repair their system of relationship. They clarified what emotional intimacy is and what is and is not acceptable. They rebuilt the connection system. They reintroduced practices that had quietly disappeared, having curiosity conversations, or let's just call it sharing feelings. Time to reflect on their daily experience together. They hadn't been doing much of that. Clear emotional check-ins. They weren't focusing on preventing betrayal. They were focusing on strengthening the relationship and the system of relating, the agreements they had about what they would relate about and how. And that system, those agreements, that understanding, the agreements that they had, the conversations they have that support the agreement, the regular meetings and discussions, the sharing of feelings, the expression of needs, and the renegotiation of needs and need fulfillment, which is inevitable, is what protected their intimacy moving forward. And what we all need to learn from Brad and Gwen is that betrayal can be or can feel devastating, and it almost never appears without a warning. In fact, if we can start to recognize the early signs of, let's call it relational drift, and actively design systems, internal as well as agreements, systems, to protect the connection, we can dramatically reduce the conditions that allow betrayal to grow. Systems involve overt understanding and agreement, clear areas of responsibility and roles responsible to the system. For example, Brad's role was to say, Gwen, it's 3 o'clock on Saturday. We said we would sit down and talk about our week today. And Gwen would say, I'm putting the baby down right now. Can we talk later? And Brad would say, okay, what time? And they'd renegotiate the time, and then they'd sit down. And then Gwen's role was to open up emotional responsibility and make sure that Brad understood that it was okay to express his feelings, whatever they were. And she would do that by demonstrating that. And she would encourage him to do the same. And when he'd hold back, she would say, Brad, I know who you are. I know you want to protect us and provide for us. I trust in you. I have confidence in you. No matter what you're feeling, share your feelings with me, please, because we don't want to go back there. Brad and Gwen, with our help, built something stronger than what had existed before. You know, when you break a bone, that bone is actually stronger when it heals. The same thing is true in a relationship. Next episode, can a partnership be stronger after rupture? I think I just made the point, but we're going to talk about why and how. So again, show us that you're impacted by what we're sharing here, that my mission to inspire that divine spark in you as a couple is coming to fruition. Like, subscribe, share, comment on YouTube. We want to hear from you. Thank you. Have an amazing day and a fantastic tomorrow.